Welcome to the Decent Crypto Podcast. Today is Tuesday, August 2nd, and we are live with a very special episode. Today is a part two, our very first part two of our most important deep dive, the merge. I've never seen Matt so excited in my life. Matt, this is a special one for you. How you feeling today?
I mean, I texted you yesterday, like, we got to do another merge episode. I can't, if it were up to me, this episode would be 10 hours long. But we'll
You've
just
been
make it
texting me every day saying, I'm so excited about the girly testnet merge. I'm so excited about this part of the merge. Man, proof of work, man. You don't know how many times I've seen the letters ST, ETH, PoW. It's like, man, nobody should be thinking about Steth, PoW. But we are here thinking about Steth, PoW. And Matt's excited. Matt's looking very excited. All right, Matt, I'm going to kick it to you. Where do you want to start?
Why don't we start with like a quick recap of our last merge deep dive?
So, as every sequel should, with a recap of what happened.
Last time on the Decent Crypto Podcast merge deep dive. So we introduced sort of the basics, right? Ethereum is switching from proof of work to proof of stake. There are a few test nets that are going to undergo this process as like a test, right? And then mainnet will undergo this process. And there was sort of like no clear time, there was a Q3, Q4 timeline as of our last episode. And since then, like a few things have changed, right? So first we had two successful hard forks or hard merges, right? So we had the Roopston testnet merge, and then we had the Sepolia testnet merge, and they both went fairly smoothly. And then currently we're awaiting a couple of updates to the Gorley testnet, and so that's expected to take place sometime next week, right?
Okay.
Then we get into like the messy stuff, right? Is there anything you want to add to the recap before we hit the messy stuff?
Definitely. Let's pause right there. Okay. So just very high level, ETH has been going through this process for years and years and years, right? Like this is easily the biggest development in the history of Ethereum, bar none. Nothing even comes close. Maybe the history of crypto altogether, right? Like
it's probably top 5 in the history of crypto altogether.
Top 5, yeah. No chain has ever successfully transitioned from proof of work to proof of stake. I don't think anybody has even tried, but nobody's ever pulled it off. So this is a massive deal. This is going to fundamentally change the nature of the hardware, the level, or like the kinds of resources that go into securing the Ethereum network. If pulled off successfully, this has massive ramifications for the future of proof of work, of proof of stake, of just generally how we think about security and consensus within crypto, right? So this is just broadly speaking a very massive deal. And so, this is why we're talking about it again. This is why we will continue to talk about it. We're probably going to have a part 3 and part 4 as follow-ups to this. But where we are now is in the very final stages, getting into the actual merge itself. We have a date, or what we think is going to be a date, right? It's mid-September. And now the impetus for all of this is that people are starting to ask the questions that really were just put off for all of these years and all of this time in the past that nobody really wanted to think about because the question was really just when merge. And it was like, oh, well, it'll happen at some point. We don't have a date. Like we've been talking about this transition to proof of stake since 2017. Even before that, I think it was in the original white paper. So now that we have a date, we've seen these test nets go through successfully. People are now starting to ask real fundamental questions about what will happen, really specifically to a lot of the contracts that are set up on chain right now, right? and the assets that have been sent to those contracts, and what will happen to those assets as well, right? So like fundamentally, I think those are some of the big questions. I think this has been tested a little bit with these test nets, but like we don't really know because nobody puts real assets on. Like the idea of a test net is that they are not real assets. These are test assets and test contracts. So I would add that that's the only thing I have to add, right? It's like, that's why we're back discussing this again, is because we're about a month and a half out from this really happening. And there is a little bit of, not a cushion, but a window where the Ethereum that people have sent and locked up on the Beacon chain, right? The new ETH2 chain, it can't be withdrawn. It can't be touched for 6 to 12 months after the actual merge happens, right? So that's another big factor going into all of this, right? So that's kind of where we are coming from. You know, Matt, you recapped some of the events that have actually occurred, but then now these are kind of the backdrops, or kind of like the context for some of the questions that we're going to start asking.
Yeah. And I guess, just to point out one other thing from our last episode that people have started discussing more is this notion of what are the miners going to do? Mm-hmm. Right. Like that really, I think, is the core question behind the events that have been unfolding like the last few days, is people are starting to ask, what are people that are mining Ethereum now, what are they going to do with that hardware? What are they going to do with those resources? Are they going to just unplug and call it a day? Are they going to switch to Ethereum Classic, or are they going to choose a third option?
So was there a specific event? Like, there's been a ton of drama, obviously, within, all these communities the past, week or so. Was there one specific event that caused all of this? Or, there are a few parties involved, and we'll get into all that. But, like, was there one specific thing that caused this? Obviously, Vitalik made a statement saying that if you're a proof of work supporter, Ethereum proof of work supporter, you should go and mine and use Ethereum Classic. But was there something prior to him saying that? Like, did he just feel the need to make a statement?
I think he made that statement like without much need, right? Like, so that was definitely one of the catalysts, but roughly simultaneously, I would say, like, Twitter started to sort of catch fire around this, like, what's going to happen narrative. So even like the bankless guys were talking about this last week. So there was...
well, the listeners should know that we talked about a potential, or really just guaranteeing that a hard fork would happen, and we would have 3 chains eventually, right? And I think maybe we should break down just a little bit, like, what we mean by the 3 chains and why this would happen, right? Like, do you want to maybe explain to the listeners, like, why there would be 3 chains? Like, you mentioned about the miners who have all this hardware. Like, maybe we can give a really brief example. Like, if we're running a mining farm, right, that has all these GPUs, and we're securing the proof of work Ethereum network, like, what kind of situation are we in? Because the miners are the ones that would fork the network, right? Like, they are the ones that would create a third chain, continue to secure that chain, and then users, if they want to, can then go and interact with that chain. But it would be the miners that are incentivized to do so. So, like, maybe we can give a little example of, like, how that might break down.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to think about it is in terms of what actually happens during the merge.
Yeah.
So let's step into that for a second. So currently we have 2 blockchains going. We have the Ethereum chain that we know and love, and then we have the Beacon chain. And the Beacon chain keeps track of staking related things, right? It tracks whose turn it is to make a block. It tracks how much ETH has been staked by each validator. It tracks, like, which validators need to attest to blocks that are proposed by other validators. So it handles, like, the metadata around, like, staking and proof of stake. And it has slots. It has these, like, empty slots. They're empty now. that will eventually contain blocks, right? So the merge happens when the main chain reaches a certain amount of total terminal difficulty, they call it. And at that point, that's when block production begins on the beacon chain. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So prior to that, these guys are not making blocks. They're observing the state of the Ethereum chain. And then when it comes time, they're going to start making blocks.
And at that time, the original Ethereum chain, will they cease making blocks?
That's been their plan.
Who is they?
The Ethereum Foundation. And primarily, now it's almost an almost religious group of people that are fully convinced that, of course, they're just going to stop. That's the plan, right? Switch to proof of stake. It's not like a add proof of stake. It's a switch to proof of stake. But in reality, the crypto is all about economic incentives, and the miners that are making blocks have no incentive to just stop mining, right?
Mm-hmm. Their incentive to stop mining would be basically just zero user activity, correct? If nobody is going to pay them, that's when they stop, right? When it's less.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. I was going to say is when it's less advantageous for them to be mining and the rewards that they get from actually mining are less than if they had just turned off their hardware and not pay the cost to keep it running. That's the point at which they will stop.
Yeah.
So you need basically zero user activity. People still mine ETH Classic, even though user activity there is pretty close to zero.
Yeah, but user activity isn't the only metric, right? The metric you need to look at is how much is a block reward worth, right? Solving for that golden hash, appending a block to the blockchain, it gives you the right to collect the block reward. And so the question is really, what is the market value of the block reward?
Sure. So it's fees, right? In the end, you're looking at user revenue, maybe not user.
Well, so today
activity,
the gas that you burn is primarily burnt when you send a transaction. That's what EIP 1559 did.
Was that on Ethereum Classic? Is that on Ethereum Classic too?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I guess my point being the level at which people will still continue to mine a network is pretty low. You can have very little revenue, you can have very little fees going through the network and people will still keep running it, right? Just because it's look, the opportunity cost is also pretty low, right? Maybe we get some kind of crazy bull market of GPUs, but I think a lot of them are about to come on the market. And for a lot of people, the best thing to do will just be to run this ETH1 fork. And if there are some people that believe in it or say they believe in it, that will be the most economically advantageous thing to do.
Yeah. And it's not even about believing in it, right? It's whether or not they can find someone to buy it off of them. Mm-hmm. Because their fees will be denominated in proof of work ETH. We'll call it ETH1, right?
Mm-hmm. What about ETH PoW?
ETH PoW? I don't know. One is easier to say. Because what is proof of stake? Is it POS or POS?
ETH POS.
Or it's just ETH, I guess. I don't know. I think ETH1 and ETH2 are really nice,
I think
clean.
ETH Classic, ETH1, ETH2, very clean.
Yeah. So we still have ETH
that's
Classic.
That's how we will refer to them.
But ETH Classic, as much as people are still mining it, it's had a lot of issues in the past. It's gotten 51% attacks. It was super cheap to do it for a while, so people would just do it.
ETH Classic, we can also call Berry ETH if we want.
Yeah, throwback, right? Let's rewind to the DAO hack, right? How did that play out, right? One of the most crucial aspects of the post DAO hack fork, and ETH Classic continuing to get mined, one of the most crucial events was the listing of ETH Classic by all these exchanges. I think it started with Poloniex, right?
Rest in peace.
People, if you give them free money, they will trade it, right? Some of them will sell it. Some of them will be bullish and buy it, right? And so you had a lot of ETH Classic maxis who thought that it was way underpriced relative to the price of Ethereum. And
the real Ethereum, yeah.
Yeah, the real Ethereum. They're let's buy that, right? And so you have to believe that you're going to see the same here. Proof of work does have its benefits, right? and people are.
So we should point out now. Yeah. So with that, right? Like proof of work definitely has its benefits. This is why Bitcoin has such a rabid community around it. Now we should point out that Vitalik himself recently said, if you are a proof of work supporter, you should go and use ETH Classic, right? He said this just a few days ago as all this drama was coming about. Yeah, I still don't really know like what the impetus was. Like, I guess he just heard all the drama and he was like, yo, like, I don't want to see all this fork nonsense. But at the same time, it's like, you remember this when the Bitcoin like SegWit stuff was going down and the block size the block size wars were going down. And you know, people were like, oh, will there be one fork? You know, what's going to happen? Like, how is this going to play out? And then what actually happened? There were like 10 forks. There was Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, Bitcoin Gold, Bitcoin Unlimited. I can't even name all the Bitcoins that people forked. But there were so many. So do you see something like that playing out here where there's like, you know, first there's ETH1, ETH2, ETH Classic, and then it's like, oh, well, you know, I ETH this, and then it's like, well, we're going to burn all the fees, and then, you know, we're going to fork it and make it, you know, I don't know, something else. Like,
Right.
Do you see something like that?
I think look, I would take a simpler approach and like first let's talk about ETH1 because there are still people today that don't think it's going to like gain traction, get listed, attract enough miners to survive, like to continue producing blocks is what I mean. And I think that like we can fully debunk that. Right. And like, let's look at why. Ethereum Classic has like almost no app development that has ever happened on it. Like I tried hard to use it a couple of months ago when we did our first merge deep dive and there was nothing to do there. Like they don't have Uniswap, right? They don't have fucking Aave or Curve or anything, right? And having that set of infrastructure is enormously valuable. Like to a blockchain and to its network effects and to attract developers to build further stuff on top of it, right? Ethereum Classic, while Vitalik might think like Vitalik like clearly has the incentive to try to push people toward that, right? Because it already exists. And a lot of people thought, you know, at the time, like a lot of ETH like, you know, the like ETH maxis, by which I mean people that were Ethereum Classic minimalists, thought that like for sure there was no way ETH Classic was going to gain enough sticking power to like be around for more than a couple of months, right? And like that got debunked. I think we can fully debunk now the myth that there isn't going to be a fork, that ETH1 isn't going to exist going forward. That's like wishful thinking on behalf of like the Ethereum Foundation, because as we'll explore later, as soon as you have one fork, it gets messy, right? But I don't know, 7 or 8. Like that's what, you know, we've heard this narrative, right, from this guy Chandler Guo. Do you know about him?
Yes. So Chandler Guo is the main proponent pushing this idea of the ETH1 fork. He's really pushing this narrative of like proof of work is all there is. Like, you know, ETH has to stay proof of work. There are a lot of conspiracy people saying like this guy just wants to dump all of his tokens into the ETH1, like the actual ETH token on ETH1, right? And then whenever there's an exchange listing, dump that all. And that's why he's driving that narrative, basically airdrop farming on retail. You know, who knows? I think there are good cases to be made on both sides. I think at this point, it would serve us well to start exploring a few of the potential ramifications, some things that maybe, you know, may get a little bit messy here.
Let's do it. You want to dig into this tweet thread? What do you think?
Yes, definitely.
So we'll link it in the show notes, but this guy Galois Capital has posted like a nice, like a 5-question, like quick questionnaire about like, you know, just thought experiment. what's going to happen.
Mhm.
And I thought it was like very instructive.
Yeah, it's a good thought experiment. So I think we should give real quick like what our initial take was when we last did this, which is I think we were both very much in alignment that there are definitely going to be three versions of the chain of Ethereum running. ETH Classic, ETH1, ETH2. We were like pretty adamant about that, right? Like I think we played out the full thought experiment in our merge episode too. Just like, why would these people stop mining when there's no incentive to? Like, I think you mentioned the fact that ETH Classic is actually a good trade around that time. So that actually turned out to be, turned out to play out very nicely. But nobody really was like playing out the rest of the scenario after that, right? Like it's like, oh, well, there are a bunch of these different kinds of smart contracts deployed on Ethereum that, either have, either they serve the purpose of creating new tokens or they serve the purpose of, holding assets or, whatever they do, right? Like Aave, Curve, and Uniswap, and even all these NFTs that are on ETH now. What happens to all those assets? What happens to all those contracts? And who? And like that's not even to mention stable coins that are centralized, right? So there's all these different questions, and we hadn't really seen them surface too much until this Galois Capital put out this tweet thread. So let's run through this real quick. He's got a few. It's good framework to center our thought experiment around, and we'll give maybe our answers to this, and then go through some other ideas that we have. So Galois, when was this? This was July 27th. So.
Yeah,
5 days ago.
Like just to highlight, like before this, talking about the potential existence of an ETH1 was just not something people did. And like single-handedly, like this thread really changed the scope of the narrative. So yeah, pretty impactful. Just a few days ago.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's run through it. Question 1: what happens during the merge? 3 options. ETH merges proof of stake successfully. Number 1. ETH1, proof of work, and ETH2, proof of stake. 3 forks, one with D-bomb. So real quick, what does the third one mean? 3 forks, one with D-bomb. D-bomb means difficulty bomb, right?
Yep. So the proof of stake chain can retain the difficulty bomb because like difficulty doesn't matter at that point. It's just like a parameter for proof of work, right?
So why does that matter exactly? Like, what is the third chain even there for in this case?
I think the third chain with the difficulty bomb is proof of stake, and I think the other 2 forks are proof of work and ETH Classic.
Okay, so he is referring to ETH Classic in this?
It was a little
unclear. It seems like this is, I don't really know what the D-bomb fork means here.
Yeah.
Very few people voted for that one. It's 13%. But I think the 2 relevant ones here are ETH1 and ETH2, proof of work and proof of stake. And then the other option being it merges proof of stake successfully. And I think here I have a little bit of a problem with the framing. I think like the wording is like a tad bit disingenuous.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like the first option is the only one that has like the proof of stake going successfully, right?
Yeah. I think that option 2 is also a success, where if you have 2 forks, like that's fine. You know, like forking is a success. Like if you have the proof of stake chain running, but then some people also decided that they want a proof of work chain as well. That's fine. That's a very successful thing.
I mean, maybe what he's referring to is a proof of work chain with a difficulty bomb, and like maybe that has implications that like we haven't considered yet.
It's possible. The one thing about Galois is he's not one to elaborate too much, so we don't know. So we're going off ourselves here, but I think we're both cleanly
everyone knows what we're thinking here.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, do you think more than ETH1 and ETH2? You think there'll be another for like an ETH Vitalik's vision?
ETH Vitalik's
ETH
vision.
VV.
Dude, I think that if there is a fork, then there will be many more forks. Yeah. It might just be fork season. I have no idea.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. Airdrop farming.
This is like, yeah, exactly. This like reminds me of the 2016, 2017 days of Bitcoin.
It's a very sensible hypothesis. Yeah.
Yeah. Just looking at the incentives. Okay.
Question two.
Question number 2. What do miners mine? 1, mostly ETH Classic. 2, mostly ETH1 remove difficulty bomb. I don't know why he has that second part in there, because there's no third option with ETH1 with difficulty bomb. So a little confused by that, but you know, it is what it is. So let's just go between those two options. Do you think that most miners mine ETH Classic, or do you think that they mine ETH1?
I think they mine ETH1.
Okay. And why do you say that?
I think they need to signal that ETH1 is going to have support. Because like ETH Classic isn't going anywhere, right? So even if it is like slightly more profitable for them to mine that, they'll choose to flag ETH to like virtue signal effectively to the world that like there's going to support ETH1, and that way they have two options.
Okay, so in this case, like, do you think the miners all kind of collude in a sense and say like, look, guys, you know, our best path forward is to cartelize basically and say, look, the hash power ain't changing. You guys can do whatever you want, but the security of the network is still here. And they basically bank on, you know, play things out for a month, you know, proof of stake. Maybe there's a few hiccups here and there. And then they say, look, guys, we're still running smoothly. All the hash power is still here. You know, they say, look, we'll let things ride for 1 month, take our losses, whatever. But maybe it works out in the end because we have this long-standing history of running the chain for whatever, 6-7 years. Maybe that's worth something to a lot of people. You know, like, is that how the miners go about it?
I mean, so it already is moderately cartelized, right? Just because of the existence of mining pools, right? So there's, you know, 4 or 5 players that like direct where most of the hash power on the Ethereum network goes, and if the leaders of those 3-4 mining pools come together and say, yeah, we're going to support ETH1, and like if you keep mining through us, you'll just mine ETH1 blocks. Then that's how it'll play out.
Has any miner, like any big mining pool or any big miner themselves, have they made any kind of signal?
I mean, yeah. So this guy Chandler Guo is like he's like a large owner of like mining equipment.
He's a big miner, yeah.
But I want to say there was even a company, I forget if they're like a pool or like a hardware manufacturer or what, but they've announced that they're like going to seed a fund to incentivize developers to continue building on ETH1.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, I mean, they're like really the miners are the only ones so far that have signaled that they're going to support ETH1 over ETH2.
Right,
obviously,
course, yeah.
Like with the greenhouse gas effects and all of that, like it's pretty taboo to have any kind of support of ETH1. It's kind of taboo to even discuss it, right? Like, you know, as soon as this guy put out this like questionnaire, he got like a lot of flack on Twitter. Like Vitalik was like, who is this guy? Is he like a joke account or something? Why does everyone follow him? You know, like just huge outrage from the community. So, you know, nobody else has like publicly come out and said, yeah, we're going to support this. But the miners generally are saying that, yeah. There's a Twitter Spaces right now hosted by Justin Sun and like a bunch of other people. It's all Chandler Guo. It's all in Chinese, and it's all about like what's going to happen next. Yeah, exactly.
Wow,
it's pretty interesting.
Dude, we should have our own Twitter Spaces where you translate.
I'm not sure if I'm like fast enough yet, but this is the only time I've been able to use Chinese for work ever, right?
Dude, not true. What about when we were at that Taiwanese party?
Oh, that's true. That was the best party of all of NFT NYC.
True.
All right, continuing. What do you think? Mostly ETH Classic, mostly ETH1. What are the miners going to mine?
ETH1.
All right.
ETH1 for sure. I think what happens is they all collude. They'll basically say, look, we're going to spin up our own chain. Dude, this reminds me so much of Bitcoin Cash, man. You have 1 to 2 really big parties that push this thing, and they make an all-out effort, push a certain narrative all over Twitter, and we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm not going to make a judgment one way or the other. I mean, I obviously think that Vitalik is he's the guy, you know, like people are going to go where Vitalik goes in the end. So,
I mean, but also,
thesis,
right? Like Vitalik is loudly publicly stating, if you like proof of work, you know, if you like Ethereum and you like proof of work, go to ETH Classic. Right. The people that are the people that are defecting that like proof of work don't care about Vitalik as much as the others, right?
So here's my thing. The only people that are saying that actually like proof of work and like Ethereum are the miners. I don't think there is like another crossover group.
Interesting.
You know?
I mean, I'm in the
group. Really don't think that exists. You think that there is a need for a proof of work Ethereum chain?
I think there's a need for a proof of work smart contract platform. And I think ETH1 is by far the best that we have the capacity for today. Yeah.
More than ETH Classic. Okay. So you think that
ETH Classic is just set up for failure, right? Like token distribution, like app development, right?
Yeah. Okay. So you think that there will continue to be like developer support, user base, and, you know, a ton of like applications that continue to get built and used on ETH1 if the miners continue to mine it?
I mean, I could see it being the place that, for example, if you were going to deploy Tornado Cash, you would deploy it on ETH1 and maybe not on ETH2. I can see it being a place where like Monero gets a native integration or something, right? It's going to be it's a different crowd, right? But yeah, I think there will be enough developer support and enough, demand for block space that, I mean, look, ETH Classic has enough demand for block space to keep going, right? Like, I do think that aggregate hash power is going to drop substantially, but I think ETH1 will wind up being the proof of work smart contract platform.
And how much actual, however you want to measure it, like whether it's like wallet activity or TVL or whatever, or market cap, like what percentage do you expect it to be versus relative to the proof of stake chain?
I would expect, this is
like,
my
let's
favorite.
Say a year.
This is my favorite. How many jelly beans in the jar question? I would expect 2 to 3% of the market cap.
Wow. Okay, that's very low.
There's going to be a ton of volatility, so I think in the first month, it'll be anywhere from 1 to 9%. And then I think like it'll settle down to like 2 to 3.
Not financial advice. Okay. Interesting. Let's move on to question number 3. Is there a non-trivial chance that USDT chooses ETH1 over ETH2? Yes, no, what the fuck?
Okay, look, I love the results here because 80% of people chose either no or what the fuck. Right? This is how little most people had thought about this when this survey was released, right? like what the fuck was a very valid response there. I mean, let's rewind a question. 50-50. 50% of people said miners are mostly going to mine ETH Caustic, even though
oh yes,
true.
true.
it's like, I would argue, hopelessly not going to be the place where hash power goes, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a point where you could 51% attack the network for like less than 100 grand.
Yeah.
It was substantially less, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
continuing,
this question
Tether.
is a little bit more relevant. Yeah. This is a crazy question, actually. Like, okay, it's not that crazy because the COO of Tether said publicly that they're going to support proof of stake ETH.
Yep.
So really not much of a question, I guess.
No,
so what happens?
That's a big deal, right? Because I don't think Circle has said anything, because they don't want to admit that proof of work ETH is going to continue happening, right? Like, it's that taboo.
So why don't they want to admit it? Like, what is the big deal there?
I think there's like a social pressure from people to not discuss ETH1. Like, if they don't talk about it, it'll go away. And that's why Vitalik was like, indicating to people that they should go to ETH Classic. So that's my theory. So is there a non-trivial chance that before we knew that Tether was going to like publicly come out and support?
Yeah. So this guy, Paolo Arduino, he basically said like, no.
Yeah. But would you have thought, I mean, I also said no. Of course, Tether's going to choose proof of stake ETH, right? Every stable issuer is going to do that. Obviously, Circle is going to do that too.
I definitely thought Circle would be the first to make that statement, and I actually thought that maybe Tether considers it, but no, seems like no. Yeah, so I guess not that huge of a question there.
I mean, the implications are massive, right? But it's just like clearly not like you're set up with this intractable issue, which is that like all of a sudden, if you had 25 billion outstanding in USDT on Ethereum, now you have 50 billion, right? You have 25 on ETH1 and 25 on ETH2. And so like you can't, you can't be fully unbacked, or you can't be half backed, right? Like you're not going to split the value 50-50 because you don't know what's going to happen with hash power or whatever. It's just like the security guarantees are just not there.
You have to pick.
Yeah.
You have to pick one.
Yeah.
Like you can't do the half and half thing.
Yeah. And if something goes wrong because you picked ETH1, you're never going to live that down. But if something goes wrong because you picked ETH2, the risk is like pretty low.
Yeah. You blame Vitalik and move on.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right, let's move on to question number 4. How do exchanges handle perps and futures? Follow ETH1, follow ETH2, follow basket. This one actually also, I don't agree with the premise. Like, why can't there just be two? Why can't they have two contracts?
I think the question is, if you have an outstanding perp today, what is the price going? How's the price going to be determined the day after the merge?
Okay, so does this go back to like the chain ID question? Which chain gets to keep the chain ID?
To the chain ID question.
Right.
So
okay, can you break down the chain ID thing real quick?
Yeah. So when you sign a transaction on Ethereum today, or on any EVM compatible blockchain, right? You sign it for a given chain ID. This is really important, right? Because if I send you 10 USDC on Ethereum, if I didn't have that chain ID, you could take that signed transaction and play it on Avalanche and play it on, on Polygon, and you could get those 10 USDC on every blockchain that was willing to like process that transaction. That's why we have chain IDs. So instead, I sign it specific to a chain ID, right? And because the signature has to match the transaction. That's like how signature verification works, right? You can only play it once on whatever chain, right? So the notion of exploiting this is called a replay attack, because you take the transaction, you replay it somewhere else. And this was actually like a huge deal for Ethereum Classic, right? So back when ETH Classic first came about, exchanges needed to implement something called replay protection. So, sorry, did you want to jump in, or do you?
Oh no, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah.
So, so replay protection is really important because here's how the attacker would exploit if you didn't implement it. They send ETH to your exchange. Then they say, withdraw ETH to my wallet. And they take that, that's just a signed transaction on the blockchain, right? They can take that and broadcast it to ETH Classic as well, because it has the same chain ID, right? And so I'm also getting the ETH Classic out of the exchange's wallet. Then I leave my ETH Classic. I just send ETH back to the exchange, and I do it again. I say, send me my ETH. They send ETH and ETH Classic, and you can quickly drain the entire balance of ETH Classic out of an exchange if they don't have this.
And were there any exchanges that forgot to implement replay protection?
I mean, there were several. I forget what the most notable one was, but
yeah, this was basically idea being this was a big thing back then. And I think now people have wised up to that.
Yeah, and that's part of why we have this chain ID system, right? And so the Ethereum people, right? Ethereum Foundation, Vitalik, Bankless guys, the Ethereum community, wants to ignore the fact that this might even happen. There is no chance in hell that they change the chain ID, right? To them, the future is obvious. They're going to Ethereum's switching. It's not forking, it's merging, right? Which is absolutely not the case, right? It's totally forking. And so they're just planning for the easy, smooth sailing path, the easy path, which is everybody just goes off of proof of stake. And of course, proof of stake retains the chain ID. It's the only chain.
So how does that exactly work? With the chain ID, right? Mm-hmm. I would assume because the beacon chain is technically live now, it would have a different chain ID. Or is it not?
Yeah. So when your transactions are getting executed, they're not really getting executed. There's a consensus engine. There's two pieces of software when you're in a validator. There's consensus and execution, and they talk to each other. And so the Ethereum blocks are happening over here in the execution part, and consensus is about more of the metadata around staking and attesting to blocks and all of that.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the easy way to think about it.
Okay, got it.
So the beacon chain probably does have a different chain ID.
Okay, and so how would it retain the original chain ID? And how does that even get determined?
So this part over here, you can think of it as the execution part. You can think of it as the EVM, the stuff that people are running to validate transactions today. Very similar piece of software that happens on proof of stake, right? And it is processing things on chain one, which is Ethereum. Right. But if you sign a transaction to post to the beacon chain, you would sign it with a different chain ID.
Right. I'm saying when, all these people are assuming there's going to be one chain and it's just going to hold the chain ID. How in practice does that work? Do you know?
Yeah. So it has to do with the execution and whether or not a transaction is accepted as valid. So if I sign a transaction for you to send me ETH, and then the signature is not going to match what they expect, right? And so it's the same as any invalid transaction if you think about it that way. So if you try to send a transaction that you don't have the private key for, it gets rejected. It's the same thing with a chain ID. It's just going to get rejected by the execution engine. So the execution engine executes according to the rules of what it's told to do. And in this case, that's the EVM and the chain ID and the signature verification and all that.
Okay, got it. So let's say in either case, right? If the chain ID, the original chain ID stays with the ETH1 chain, or if it goes to the, ETH2 proof of stake chain, how in practice do the miners, the validators come to a consensus on what the new chain ID will be? Does that need to be set and established by the Ethereum Foundation, or by like the set of validators or by the set of miners?
It's a social consensus, right? So obviously, like,
so everybody's just going to start broadcasting transactions with the same exact format, and then everybody else is going to agree.
I think like in reality, what you'll see is like an ETH1 foundation or something of that sort, right? That gets started by like 2-3 people that have any kind of like weight in the community.
Yeah, I think this guy Chandler is already setting up like EthereumPoW.com, EthereumPoW.org, whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
So
now it's a question of like, are they gonna like, do they have their shit together enough as a community to come to any kind of agreement by the time the merge happens? And I would argue yes. Like honestly, Binance could just be like, this is the chain ID. You want to send ETH1? Send it. You have to send it like a transaction with this chain ID. And
you know what's super interesting to me about all this is like it really shows where the actual power in the industry is held.
Yeah.
And who gets to really decide, right? Like, or not even who gets to decide, just like, you know, so much of this stuff comes down to a social consensus. And like, how does that form? We're finding out right now in real time.
Yeah, I mean, look, the incentive is for everyone to come to any kind of consensus. Does it really matter what the chain ID is? Absolutely not, right? You know, it could be chain 69, it could be chain 420. It really doesn't matter. Obviously, one of those would be great. But chain ID 1, that's just going to belong to Ethereum proof of stake because otherwise, like Ethereum proof of stake, it's like they're playing a game of chicken, right? Ethereum proof of stake is not going to blink first. They're not going to flinch, right? They're very much devoted to this notion of this is going to be chain ID 1 is the proof of stake version. Moreover, every exchange, and like that's like a big place where power accrues in this dynamic, right? Every exchange is also operating a staking business. So they have like a huge business interest in like rolling with that narrative. But they also have a business interest in someday supporting ETH1, right? The proof of work ETH. And so for them,
they have, yeah, they have a trading business as well.
Yeah.
So they need that trading revenue. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting because in the past, eventually all the exchanges have started to support all these forks. You know, they might resist it initially, but then they all come around, right? Just seeing that, okay, somebody else is now supporting it. Same thing. It's like a social consensus. It's like, oh, it's too taboo first to talk about ETH1. Then it's too taboo to list ETH1. Then it's too taboo to dump all your ETH1. You know, it's like, well, it's not going to happen. Like,
yeah.
So bringing this back to question 4, which was how do exchanges handle perps and futures? It sounds like we're both saying follows ETH2, but eventually they will list ETH1 on spot exchanges, and then they'll have futures and, you know, all these contracts that track it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now there is a question here though, right? Which is when you borrow an asset and it forks, generally, or airdrops or whatever. Like I've seen this a couple of times now where like it's generally written in the contract that like if it's a legitimate fork with like enough hash power or whatever, you are required to pay back the lender in both sides of the fork.
You're joking.
No.
This is for like centralized exchanges or for DeFi?
Yeah, for like BlockFi, for example. Like if I borrow Bitcoin and like, I don't know if Bitcoin Gold or Bitcoin SV would hit the like, the test here, right? But I think Bitcoin Cash very much would, where I would have to pay, if I borrow Bitcoin, when I pay it back, I have to, if it's forked into Bitcoin Cash in the meantime, I have to pay it back. I have to pay the Bitcoin Cash back. It's the same as borrowing a stock and having to pay back the dividends. Right? Like you were given them as the like borrower. Like if you held on to it, you were given them. Like, but the point of borrowing is like to sell, I guess. But you know, you need to pay it back. Same thing with stock splits, right? Like this is just like how lending should work. Obviously it's way more complicated in blockchains, but yeah, that's the general idea. So that's the only reason I can think of that like perps and futures might actually follow ETH1 and ETH2, like the sum of the values of them. Because if you have borrowed ETH and you need to pay it back, you know, if ETH1 gains any substantial, like, you know, 0.5% of market cap, you're gonna have to pay that back too.
You're gonna have to pay it back in the like native ETH, or you're gonna
You
have to pay it back
ETH and ETH1. So if you borrow 100 ETH before the merge, you're gonna owe 100 ETH1 and 100 ETH2 after the merge. Fucking crazy, right?
Yeah. Interesting. So maybe you borrow against your ETH and ETH1, or just against your ETH, right? You borrow. What if you borrow? Right. Okay. What if you? Okay. So this is like the part that you were super excited about, talking about what happens to DeFi.
Yeah.
In you know, with the merge. To be honest, now that I'm looking at it, this might have to be a whole other episode.
Oh, it definitely will. We
will talk about
like
it.
DeFi post merge is going to be the like end of the world episode, but we can tease at it.
Yeah, we'll tease at it. Yeah. But real quick, so actually, let's finish this Galoy Capital thread.
There's just one more question,
and then we'll get into the DeFi part.
Beautiful.
Okay. What happens to staked ETH? Steth, like the Lido staked ETH product, not staked on the Beacon chain.
Yep.
Right? What happens to Steth? Withdrawable on ETH1, wrecked. So this actually leads into the question I was going to ask.
Sorry.
Matt just had a nice little spillage here. Okay, got too excited about what happens to Steth, man. We touched DeFi and Matt's like, yeah, Matt's fully losing it over here. Okay, so question 5. What happens to Steth? Withdrawable on ETH1 or wrecked? So the question that I was going to ask was basically like, all these assets, do they just go to zero, right? Like on chain 1, on ETH1. So yeah, with Steth, like, what do you think happens? Like, how would you be able to even withdraw it, right? Like,
you won't be able to withdraw.
You won't. There's no chance.
So look, as ETH1 gets continued, there's going to be a need for a hard fork to accomplish a couple of things. You have to change the chain ID, right? And you also have to change the, like, you have to remove the difficulty bomb, right? If you're already doing that hard fork, you could build in a fork of the state, right, that airdrops people ETH1 if they had previously staked that ETH.
Okay, I see.
Like, the Beacon chain is never going to issue a command that ETH1 will listen to, right? Where it's like, yeah, here you go and stake, right?
Yeah.
The only way to do it is like if the community as a whole, and really like the people that own the, like, it's the miners in this scenario, right? Like, they're the ones with the power.
Yeah.
If the miners collectively decide that they want to honor people that have staked and like give them, like, airdrop them some free ETH1, like ETH1 ETH, then, like, you know, maybe they would airdrop some to Lido, and then Lido could decide to start honoring that through their, like, withdrawal contract.
So basically, if you had Lido staked ETH, right, or if you have it now and you stay in that position on ETH1, that is just going to be worth nothing.
Yeah,
right?
It would take like a lot of fucking mental gymnastics to come to a world where that's worth anything. Like,
and the reason for that is that that token is literally just a representation of proof of stake Ethereum on the Beacon chain. The whole idea of ETH1 is that you're staying on proof of work, so the proof of stake Ethereum should have no value, right? It kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it's never withdrawable, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. Because that reality that you're planning for with Lido staked ETH will never occur under these circumstances, right?
Yeah, and that's why Lido staked ETH should be trading at a discount, right? And you can kind of arrive at a price range for like what ETH1 is going to be worth based on the market value of staked ETH relative to ETH.
The discount of staked ETH is like what people are expecting the market cap of that fork to be.
Yeah, and today it's like 2 and a bit percent, like 2.7 or something last I checked.
Okay.
But
so is that how you're coming to that conclusion?
No, I think you really have to apply at least a 2.7% liquidity discount, right?
Like just no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what's the cost of capital here, right?
That is true, yeah.
Like crypto's really fucking risky. Anything can happen, and if you need that liquidity for some reason, like you're wrecked on staked ETH. Like you'd rather just hold ETH, right? So
yeah.
I think 2.7 sounds pretty reasonable just for the liquidity discount. Considering, look, the merge hasn't even happened yet, right? Like something might go wrong, right? It's taboo to say this, but like something might go wrong, right?
Yeah.
So
staked ETH is overpriced.
I think it's way overpriced. Yeah. Not financial advice.
Not financial advice.
Now, what's interesting is almost everyone in the world is placing the opposite trade here. I mean, you can see this by how the gap has closed, right? Like almost everyone in the world thinks staked ETH is underpriced because, of course, it's going to go to 100% the value of ETH, right? Because the merge is happening, right? So kind of an interesting.
I also think, yeah, exactly. I think people are underpricing the time value of money maybe a little bit too, you know?
Yeah.
It's like,
look, people
I don't know if people realize
yield.
that this is not withdrawable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't understand. It's like, dude, this is crypto. Like you can, if you really put in the time, like you can find 100 baggers every year or 2 years, you know?
Yeah.
Why are you trying to get 4% on
yeah, I mean, look,
like
I'm
random assets, you know?
enormously bullish ETH, right? I'm not fucking staking my ETH. Right? I'm not gonna live forever.
If you're enormously bullish something, put it in cold storage, bro. Like,
or you like buy perks, right? Take some fucking leverage on. Be a real.
Oh yeah, Matt has recently discovered leverage. It's fun. It's fun. It's like giving a child an AK-47. You know?
My favorite text you sent me was, "It's like watching man discover fire."
Oh man, yeah. Some funny ass text late at night. Okay, so now let's tease a little bit of the fun stuff here. So, staked ETH is one component
goes to zero
of the DeFi ecosystem that really we think goes to zero because it's a product that exists in a reality that can never come to be, right? Staked ETH, fundamentally, there's no staking in proof of work. It's not going to happen. Like it should be worth zero, but there are assets that you could argue maybe shouldn't be worth zero, or like you don't really know what they should be worth because like, what do you even do, right? So one prime example is like everything that's in Maker, right? Maker is a protocol that lets you mint its native stablecoin DAI backed by different kinds of native assets on Ethereum. And, you know, that asset could be ETH itself and you mint DAI, right? So now what is that DAI worth on ETH1, right? And then that DAI is in these
curve
pools that are pegged. The way they maintain an equal price on the stablecoin is that it's in these like, you know, multi stablecoin pools where it has, you know, USDC, USDT, used to have UST, rest in peace, and now you know, and then it has DAI or, you know, some other stable coin as well. And it maintains price stability by like basically managing the levels of liquidity of all of those. So,
I mean, it's baked into the protocol. It's a stable swap protocol. It's baked into the protocol that they all have the same value.
And so when, you know, the question that we posed earlier comes to be, which is USDT goes to zero because Tether has already said that they won't support it. What happens to DAI on ETH1?
Moreover, then like, okay, so like playing out the scenario here, right? Maker requires Chainlink to function to update its Oracle price for the price of ETH. Obviously, the price of ETH is going to be way lower on ETH1 than ETH2, or it'll at least be fucking different, right? So then what? You'll be able to
prove. Well, how will we even discover the price?
Say the value is, yeah, exactly. So there is no price. Chainlink
there is no price, right?
Like can't provide a price Oracle update for ETH1 because there's no price.
Because there is no exchange that will be supporting it. Like,
yeah.
Is Uniswap going to support? Is Uniswap on ETH2 going to support ETH1 ETH? Like, you know, like
absolutely not, right?
like,
but the issue is
the
issue is that like, look, like when it comes down to it, the only thing that we can even point to and be like that has some value is ETH1, is the native ETH, right? And like, who knows? Like anything can have value, right? But stablecoins definitely have zero value. And so you have no basis. You have no basis for valuation on chain when the primary asset that you're ascribing value to has no like tradable market, has no liquid market, right? So,
well, okay, so like it has no liquid market in stablecoin terms, right?
Yeah.
What if you go on Uniswap on ETH1 and you want to trade your ETH1 ETH for Uniswap, like the Uni token on ETH1?
That's
right?
the question. What is a Uni token on ETH1 worth,
Yeah.
right? Like when you don't have any
Like,
stablecoins, it quickly becomes impossible to really like have a tractable dollar value for anything.
How can you have price discovery, right? Like without stablecoins, it's tough.
You can have it off-chain the way we always did on centralized exchanges. It's going to take them a minute to implement this stuff, right? So the early days, I think everything dumps, and ETH1 is by far the most valuable asset as a percentage of total ERC20, like whatever metric you want to use, right? On this.
But if there's no exchange, right? Like, what are the very first few transactions that happen? Like, I think there are some big MEV transactions where the miners literally drain every liquidity pool on every single decentralized exchange, swap every single asset everywhere for ETH1 immediately within like the first few transactions. And then there's just a bunch of ETH1 and zero of every other asset.
Well, no, so in the Uniswap pool, it's a bunch of every other asset and zero ETH1 remaining. Yeah,
exactly. Right. It's the other way. There's just billions and trillions of whatever of every other asset just sitting in these pools that nobody will ever bid on, right?
Right, but there will be different amounts of each of them, right? So there will be like profitable opportunities here to borrow something on one market, on one like borrowland market, and swap it for another one somewhere else. Use that to governance attack something, which releases their underlying ETH1 treasury, right? Like this is going to be absolute chaos, and I can't wait to watch it all unfold.
It's going to be a lot of MEV snipers or just snipers in general, chain snipers.
I mean, look, Flashbots, there's no reason Flashbots can't continue to function for ETH1.
Right. I would assume that they will be the snipers, right? They'll just go in and clean house.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense, right? So I would imagine the first few blocks probably... Look, you can't really say enormously valuable because we have no idea what the value of ETH1 is going to be. And at the time that it happens, we'll still have no idea what the value of ETH1 is going to be, right?
But if there is any value on that chain, right, we can all agree that the only value for any asset will be, or like the only asset that will accrue any value on that chain will be the ETH1 asset, like the native asset itself, right?
Potentially, right? It depends on, look, Aave could be like, yeah, you know, we'll support this. We'll roll out software. Like when a new contract upgrade comes out, we'll just roll it out for both chains. What's the problem? Right. Or whatever, my bigger fear here is, this is my real doomsday scenario, the bridges. The bridges are going to get fucking wrecked if they don't handle this shit carefully, right? So
what do you mean?
Okay, so 2 blocks in, everyone has swapped all of their USDC for native ETH1, right? You can buy up $1 billion of USDC one for like nothing, for like 0 ETH, well, like 1 ETH1, right? Let's say you bridge that to whatever, and if the permission bridge runner is listening to the wrong chain or something, and at this point if they still have the same chain ID, there's huge potential for Avalanche to accidentally print someone $1 billion USDC.
Interesting.
This is where I get
we see bridge
really
hacks every
concerned
day.
about. Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Like literally every day. Yeah.
Literally earlier today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
I don't know if you close off the bridges or what, right? Look, if I were anyone involved here, I would put a moratorium on Oracle updates, on borrow lend creation redemption, on swaps for like 10 blocks prior to the merge, 10 blocks after, or something.
And the smart contract development team can just implement that into the contract?
Yeah, so you can have like, imagine if there was some bug that was discovered in like Compound. The Compound DAO can issue an emergency order to like freeze, right?
This is DeFi, baby.
Look, it has to be decentralized, right? Everyone has to agree on it, but yeah.
Oh, true. True.
If that governance vote passes, and like, look, like I wouldn't, this isn't going to happen, right? But if I were the person or the people running Maker, for example, like I would have to think really carefully about what I want to allow to happen until Xbox post merge.
It's going to be messy, man.
Yeah.
We're going to have to do a couple more episodes about this. The next one will certainly be about DeFi. And then we'll have to do like a 5-minute segment about NFTs, just because nobody really cares.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's leave it right there. There's tons more to talk about, but I think we hit on some interesting stuff. We'll be back in a few days to cover everything that happened this week. It's already shaping up to be a big week. So yeah, we'll be back on Saturday with another decent recap. This was part 2 of the merge, and to make sure to join our Twitter Spaces sometime next week for the Gurley testnet merge. That'll be our very first Twitter Space. Excited for that one. We'll be back in a few days. Until then, stay decent.
None of this was financial advice, legal advice, investment advice, or any other kind of advice. If you're looking for advice, you are definitely in the wrong place. Until next time, stay decent.